There's been a lot of coverage about white supremacy lately, and for good reason. The election of Donald Trump seems to have emboldened people to express views previously deemed beyond the pale. But covering America's neo-Nazis carries a risk, as the New York Times learned the hard way. Adam has more.
Ever since Charlottesville, the media's been trying to explain the seeming renaissance of America's white supremacists.
We're standing in solidarity for the white race.
Which is why the New York Times introduced its readers to Tony Hovater, an Ohio man the paper says has 4 cats, fine Midwestern manners, and a penchant for Hitler and white separatism. The goal seemed to be a deep dive into the inner life of a neo-Nazi, who also enjoys Seinfeld and NPR. But many readers were deeply unimpressed.
But they go there and they try to humanize this evil white supremacist.
There were less flattering details, like Hovater's involvement with a Radio Aryan podcast. But there was no sign reporter Richard Fawcett challenged Hovater's beliefs, like the Holocaust being exaggerated. In a companion piece, Fawcett said he tried and failed to understand Hovater's deeper motives, leaving a hole at the heart of his piece. To which CJR replied, sometimes if you're left with a hole at the heart of a story, better not to run it at all.
Well, Dan, as you know, Dean Baquet, who's African-American himself, said, this is a total overreaction, people being upset by this. He says, that's just a bunch of academics who don't know anything about journalism. What was your reaction?
When I read that thing, I almost puked. It was so overwritten, and it felt to me like, those stories that they run during the Olympics, where they go back to someone's hometown, and they're so over the top. Exactly. Yeah. It's like, John grew up in the fields of whatever. And I thought, wow, this is a story where you're writing that way, and it really, from the standpoint of just, as a good writing, I thought it was overwritten. But I also believe that it did tend to humanize it and make it seem normal. It felt like it was a PR piece for this guy to make him come off as saying, you know what, I'm not like those really bad racist people. I'm better than that.
Listen to NPR.
And that's what it felt. It felt like a really slick PR piece, poorly executed.
I think that was the big problem. The bigger problem was execution than concept. I mean, the writer's essay about his piece was really telling because, he was trying to scratch an interesting question, which is how does somebody who has the normal trappings of life turn, and go in this really devastating direction. He admitted, and I understand there's not always a smoking gun. You're not always going to be able to get the guy to tell you, I went into 7-Eleven one day and someone said something to me and now I'm a Nazi. So if you're not going to get that, and the lack of that you're accepting as part of your story, you still have to scratch at that fundamental question in a way that he didn't. Maybe by talking to people around the person, maybe by digging deeper into his past. You have to show somehow that you're not just talking about his cats, but you're actually trying to answer the question.
But I think you can do that with one quick line and say something about, this is not the place you'd expect to, or he is not the person you'd expect to do X, and then move on. But it spent a lot of time painting this picture that I thought was disturbing.
There were major problems of focus and tone with the piece. And I thought he got plenty from this guy. I wouldn't have killed the story. But what we weren't really hearing from, there are all kinds of other people that he could have talked to. People in the African-American community, in the LGBT community, the Jewish community. I mean, the Nazis, that would be appropriate.
The Holocaust denier.
Real experts on neo-Nazi hate. Those voices were either not in there at all or just hinted at. And let me just close by saying Dean Baquet's statement was so condescending. It was unbelievable. And most of the criticism I've heard are from journalists. Or when they are from academics, they're from academics who used to be journalists.
I thought Dean Baquet's statement was terrible. I can't believe he went public with that. Mark Lacey, the national editor of the Times, I thought gave a much more responsible reaction, saying, we have heard the complaints. Here's what we tried to do. We understand people may feel that we fell short. We're attentive to your concerns. That's the way to do it. there are so many things you can complain about here. There's the cute lead talking about their wedding registry at Target and saying that his wife, Hovader's wife, was afraid Antifa was going to crash their reception because weddings are stressful enough, even when you're not married to a white supremacist. This sort of like a New York Times style section type introduction just made me want to gag to the point. There is, as who's the guy who writes for BuzzFeed? Charlie, is it Wurzel, who writes a lot about the tech world, the sort of online sphere that neo-Nazis inhabit. That was barely delved into at all. And I think it's totally valid to say there was no pushback. Okay, he says the Holocaust is overblown. There was no indication that this reporter, Richard Fawcett, said, what do you mean overblown? Did 5 million people die? Did 1 million people die? Or other statements like that. So a bunch of drop balls, and it's too bad. It's too bad. Really a case study in how not to do this sort of coverage.
And there have been some outlets, including the Globe, the Atlantic, that have done really good coverage of people who have, who are part of that community, that plumbs a little deeper.
Listen, the Globe fell off the face of the earth this week with that stupid story about the flat earthers. They didn't challenge him either.
However,
I didn't want to roll that into this, but it was like, oh, yikes.
However, to pick up on Joanna's point, I think that if you want to know how to report on the right in a balanced way, Matt Visor's series on York, Pennsylvania has been fantastic. Yeah.